Hello, you're watching TelecomTV. I'm Martin Warwick. We are at the OPNFV Summit 2016 here in Berlin, Germany, and this panel discussion is on the subject of open source and the communication service provider. And I'm joined by three panel members who are extremely knowledgeable in this area, and I'm going to introduce them straight away, starting with the lady immediately on my left, Jéhanne Savi from Orange. Welcome. On your left, Chris Price from Ericsson. Chris, I haven't seen you for at least an hour. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And on Chris's left, another Chris Wright from Red Hat, who I haven't seen for about 25 minutes.
Right.
So welcome back everyone, and welcome Jéhanne for the first time. OPNFV is a toddler, but very healthy, and is getting towards its second birthday, so you can expect the tantrums to start fairly soon. The question is how are communication service providers, CSPs, and the wider NFV ecosystem benefiting from participating in OPNFV and other open source projects? And Jéhanne, I'm going to ask you that one first. So what do you think?
So I will begin maybe by the proof of our belief, because we are a co-founder of the OPNFV, which is itself significant. What we expect from it and from the open source communities, broadly, is a fast innovation, in fact, because traditionally telcos love standardization, and they need standardization, meaning they need, in fact, interoperability. And so in a fast-moving environment and non-stabilized ecosystem, the open source communities are a good answer to that, because they allow fast innovation and kind of set standards de facto.
Okay.
And the second point is maybe kind of sustainability promise also. I don't know if you would confirm.
No, I can agree. I might add that the convergence that we get from the convergence around the fast innovation, I think, is the real value that comes through. That's what removes the need for a lot of documentation and discussion on standardization. So the activity of convergence that we actually see, so some of the activities we have in OPNFV which have a broader community engagement, we really do see a convergence around the outcomes of those, because there's a lot of people invested in getting that function through. So I think that's one of the real values that we've seen, at least as a vendor, to be able to produce a feature that we know people want because they've helped us produce it.
I think working with open source communities, we have a new advantage over the standardization process, where standardization, you're looking at pure interoperability, black box interoperability, which means a couple of things. One, you've got duplicated effort. So you built it here, and you didn't share your resources in terms of what you're building. The other is, as you're integrating across layers, you have to have clear interfaces and protocols and everything to ensure that black box interoperability. With open source projects, you can change both sides together. And that's really fundamentally different. And that's what allows the speed and the innovation that we're all trying to get to. And I think it's probably the part that OPNFV has really been focused on, is trying to bring all these different pieces together. So you could go to any one community and make a change, and it's potentially insufficient to solve the problem, the use case. Get the carriers up and running with the right performance and availability is really the end goal. If you're only making the change of one layer, you haven't solved the problem. So with OPNFV, we have this kind of broad ecosystem perspective, open source project ecosystem perspective, saying we got to make these changes across a whole stack, and then we can ensure that that's happening, test, validate.
Sure. The end-to-end is a real added value.
Yeah.
It's quite tricky for me, this, because I've got two Chris's in front of me, and I can't really call you Chris 1 and Chris 2, so I'll use your full names. I'm moving on to the second question. I'm going to ask, first of all, I'm going to ask you, Chris Wright, to stay on the spot, as it were, for a moment. Sure. Okay, so I understand the background of what you've been saying, I understand why it's working and how it works. How do you select which initiatives to participate in, given there are quite a lot of them?
Well, we toss a coin and pick the first one that comes up. Actually, We really, it's kind of scratch your own itch. So it's open source. So you look at what problems do you have to solve for your customers, and you focus there. And so that's exactly what we do. The places that we've been most engaged are either feature enablement, so IPv6 as an example, or looking at how do we ensure that we're getting the right performance out of the virtual switching layer in this platform that we're building up. Also, we're trying to ensure that we can deploy and manage this kind of complex beast of a platform that's built up of a bunch of different components. So we've put a lot of effort into installer and deployment tools. Ultimately, our view is the success is kind of the end-to-end CI/CD pipeline that we can build in OPNFV. So we ingest all these different changes and test and validate. And so deployment's critical, and then a few of the features that we are seeing as critical to our customers are the ones where we place our focus.
I'll come to you, Jéhanne, now if I might. So this is the same question. Looking at it from a service provider's viewpoint from Orange, how do you select which initiatives to participate in? For example, is it something that's generated from within Orange itself and you say, this is a problem we need to solve, we need to provide these services and applications? Or is it that something that comes from your customers, the end users, whether it be enterprise or the domestic user of your services, do they come to you, or do you get a feeling, or do you get knowledge that they need something and something has to be done?
In Orange, we see the transformation in very business-driven way. So it's mostly driven by the customer needs, and as you said, Chris, by the end-to-end approach of this customer need. For example, we got involved in the OPNFV from the start. We were one of the co-founders. So we are, yes, very committed and very engaged in the open source communities for this. And we also believe that we could build services thanks to open source products, even in a freemium approach, for example. So that's mostly the way we work.
Okay, thank you. Same question to you, Chris Price. What do you do at Ericsson?
A little bit like Chris, but we use paper and a hat, and then we pull out the... No. Of course, it is working with customers. So we work with our customers. We talk about virtualization, and we talk about 5G networks and how we create network slicing. And they start to talk about, we need this if we're going to do that. We need to be able to couple these things together in some way. And so we start to work on these types of requirements. And what we're trying to do is build in the requirements that we want to go to market with in 6 months to 18 months, let's say. So it's very much a forward planning activity as far as trying to choose the products or choose the features and areas we want to work on. And there is a flip side which sort of comes to the open source replacing standards piece. We need to investigate, so we do a lot of investigative development on features and capabilities in the virtualization layer that could subsume the role of some of the standard interfaces that we've used before when it comes to network-to-network component interfaces. If I have the ability to create network slicing and I have an infrastructure which is ubiquitous within that slice, I can leverage that infrastructure to replace some of the old functions that I used to have to do as an external control plane, for instance.
Okay, thank you. Right, moving on. We've looked at the OPNFV and open source and the open initiatives around the place, and seeing what benefits they have and the good parts of it. What about the other side of the coin? The downside, the challenges, the difficulties, the politics, that kind of stuff. What are the sort of challenges that communication service providers and vendors have to address when you're adopting an open source approach, not simply from the technical side, but also from the fact that these are a variety of companies and organizations with their own interests, and we know a lot about how the ecosystem works, etc. But also here, and I speak to a lot of people about this, that it can be a bit edgy sometimes.
I'll jump to the chase on this one.
Okay.
One of the things which as a telecommunications vendor, equipment vendor, we have difficulties coming to terms with is that in an open source community you can do what you want to do. I have this idea and I would like to do it, and I would think everyone would like to explore this with me. A lot of other people have the same idea, but they want to explore it in a different way. And it's okay in open source that 5 people go off and do the same thing. to find where the result is, rather than in standardization where you would say, okay, we all disagree. Before we proceed, we have to figure out how we can agree and come to some level of consensus. Consensus through meritocratic results is how things are done in open source. That's difficult to accommodate from a traditional development perspective, where you generally have had complete control of your code and the decisions that you take as to how it's influenced.
And what effect does it have on the day-to-day working and how you proceed?
I think it just changes the decision process. In a day-to-day working, I would proceed how I would generally proceed. I'm going to write the code. And if there is someone that agrees with me, I want to write it with them. I want to collaborate. The decision process around that, though, is a little more complicated, because I have to realize that what I'm building may not be eventually what the community in general, the service provider community, deems to be the right approach. And that will be borne out over time. So I have an investment which is risk-based in a solution which may or may not turn out to be the one that I would eventually be using in the longer term anyway.
We'll come to Jéhanne as a representative of service provider in a moment, but over to the other Chris Wright from Red Hat. What do you say to that question?
Well, I think there's some cultural shift that's really part of the challenge here. Chris alluded to it. It's in an environment where we've had service providers really owning the purse strings and telling vendors what to do through a standardization process, saying, I would like you to be compliant with this. And there really isn't a lot of negotiation room there. Here, you come to an open source community. That community is solving a diverse set of use cases, some of which are outside the scope of this telecommunications industry altogether. You have no authority to tell them what to do. The best you can do is engage and collaborate and show willingness to be a part of a process that's going to generate a solution. And that's time-wise, it means you have to do some thinking ahead. So you're doing this roadmap planning and really anticipating where you want to be, as opposed to looking at how many developer hours it's going to take to get from here to there. So that's a really big shift for the industry. And from the open source communities, we're looking at it from, we don't always understand what you're talking about because you're speaking this strange foreign language. It's acronyms and it's telecommunications local vernacular. So there's some learnings to go both directions. And OPNFV is really kind of this buffer between those two communities, trying to build that communication conduit and understanding, mutual understanding, and a place for collaboration across the industry and with the upstream community so that we can evolve the code base and actually solve real problems.
Thank you. Jéhanne, you, as a representative of a service provider, in the past, there's been a lot of concern among service providers around the world about lock-in. About the fact that you buy your equipment, your infrastructure, whatever it may be, from one or two or three vendors, and the vendors, of course, wanted to keep your custom forever, or certainly for as long as they possibly can, so they want to lock you into it. What NFV and SDN has done is to loosen that lock. It doesn't really do it all together. So what do you make of this?
I won't say, strictly speaking, that open source is an answer to vendor lock-in, because you may fall in the integrator lock-in then. So I don't see it as a key answer to that. But still, it's a challenge not to go for the integrators lock-in. For me, the two challenges are probably the skills and the culture, as you said, because you need to involve, of course, in the community and to expose yourself in a certain way. So this is the first point, and we have probably scarce skills for that in traditional telcos. And the second challenge for me is more from the ecosystem standpoint, what you said, Chris, the fragmentation, because you can have many initiatives more or less on the same subject, and then how do we provide sustainability if we use these open source solutions, and since we have launched commercial offers based on that potentially. So that's the key concern.
Thank you. Looking at the time, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I've got a question, perhaps 1.5 questions left to ask you in that time. Depends how things go. But I'd like to ask you, and again, let me stay with you, Jéhanne, on this, because you are from Orange and you are providing service out to a wider audience. What changes have you seen as a result of your participation in OPNFV and other open source projects?
So maybe I will come back to this question of skills. It's kind of transformation agent, I would say, or a learning platform. I don't know how to phrase it, but really for us, our involvement in OPNFV is key, both for guaranteeing our services and industrialization, excuse me. But also building that with the communities or with other telcos with the same concerns and the same purpose in terms of customer experience. We are able to transform, and once again in a context where we seek interoperability and where we seek sustainability.
Thank you. I don't know who to ask of you two, so you might just fight it out amongst yourselves.
I'll pitch in. Go on. Because I'm kind of thinking a little bit about the relationship that as an equipment vendor I have with a customer.
Sure.
When you move from I have the box and I sell it to you and you can ask for new knobs and things and this is the relationship that we have, to the relationship where we're both looking at something in the bright open field, and as a product manager or as a salesperson, I have to engage with a customer that knows as much about this as I do. The dialogue changes significantly, and then it comes to Chris's point. When it comes to developing features, it's around a longer term view on how you want that to evolve. It's a longer term view on how the people in your company engage with other people in other companies, and to some extent the really interesting thing is the flipping of relationships inside a company when you start to get this right, in that the product manager is no longer just telling the design group what's happening and what they should be doing, but the product manager is now asking the designers for guidance, and there's a trust relationship that has to sort of be adjusted in order to make this a workable engagement moving forwards. And that's one of the biggest changes I've seen, and it sort of bears out in the way that we engage with customers now, that our customers are asking different questions, are asking different things of us than they were when it was just putting a box in the network and switching on the lights. So I mean, that's the biggest difference I think I've seen.
Thank you. Chris, the last word goes with you because we are out of time. So what's your take on this?
Well, for us, it's been an opportunity to learn a lot. So we're exposed to a great cross-section of the industry and hearing a lot about real requirements, and that's awesome from the perspective of, you know, what kind of changes do we need to make to the open source projects that are going to be used to deliver solutions to the end customer. We've also, on the flip side, been able to educate a lot because we have a lot of experience in open source. So we're learning more about the telecommunications industry. We're helping the telecommunications industry learn more about open source, and it's been a really great experience. I think one of the things that we experience in that kind of customer-vendor relationship, we often call it partnership because you really are working together, and our end goal is to not only provide the solution but also to incorporate the customer's feedback directly into the product requirements from an open source upstream project point of view, to the degree that, if possible, they can even get directly involved. And that's one of the things that's awesome to see folks like Orange directly involved in projects like OPNFV.
It's fascinating to see an industry dynamic changing before our eyes. You've come up with some really good responses to this. So I'd just like to say, Jéhanne Savi, Chris Price, Chris Wright, thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, Martin.